And the committee will come to order. Good morning, everyone. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time. As a reminder, members participating in a hearing remotely should be visible on camera throughout the hearing. For members participating in person, masks are optional as per the Office of Attending Physician. As with in-person meetings, members are responsible for controlling their own microphones. Members can be muted by staff only to avoid inadvertent background noise. As a reminder, statements, documents, or motions must be submitted to the electronic repository to sccc.repository@mail.house.gov. Finally, members or witnesses experiencing technical problems should inform committee staff immediately. Okay, now that that's out of the way, good morning. Welcome to the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis hearing, Turning the Tide for Ocean Climate Action, Unleashing the Climate Benefits of Our Blue Planet. And before we get going, I want to acknowledge that there are students in the rooms, the Scuba Nauts International, as we hear about during the hearing. Marine science and observations are the cornerstone of ensuring a safe, healthy, and sustainable planet and ocean. These Scuba Nauts are already getting a start in becoming the next generation of scientists and policymakers, and maybe even a future NOAA administrator. So welcome to our Scuba Nauts today, and I'll recognize myself for a 5-minute opening statement. Happy Ocean Month and Capitol Hill Ocean Week. As we celebrate the progress that we've made to sustainably manage our ocean, our coasts, our marine ecosystems, we must also look at additional policies and investments needed to conserve and restore them. And I'm worried. We know climate change is impacting our ocean, leading to increases in water temperature, rising sea levels, acidification, deoxygenation, and changes in circulation. And the climate crisis is an ocean crisis, which means the ocean must be part of our national climate strategy, and we must invest in ocean-based climate solutions. The ocean plays a critical role in our global climate. It helps regulate temperatures, it absorbs excess heat, it supports countless ecosystems. It also supports millions of jobs. We know this in Florida, in the Tampa Bay area, including over 500,000 jobs in Florida alone. But the ocean is stressed out. It has absorbed between 20 and 30% of all human-caused carbon pollution since the 1980s. And it has absorbed more than 90% of excess heat since 1970. That's why it's crucial that we conserve seagrasses, mangroves, and other coastal habitats which sequester more carbon per area than any terrestrial habitat. It's crucial that we protect our coral reefs, which can mitigate the impacts of intense hurricanes, rising sea levels, and storm surge in places like Florida. And it's crucial that we conserve open ocean and deep sea ecosystems, which may also be able to sequester carbon according to emerging research. But we cannot stop there. Ocean climate action is also about harnessing offshore wind energy and emerging technologies like wave and tidal power. These clean energy sources can help secure America's energy independence while reducing our dependence on costly fossil fuels. And they can help us meet our climate targets. According to research by the High-Level Panel for a Sustainable Ocean Economy, ocean-based climate solutions can help reduce heat-trapping pollution by nearly 4 billion tons per year by 2030 and 11 billion tons per year by 2050. That's more than the equivalent of shutting down every coal-fired power plant around the world. So as we unleash this potential, we must also be proactive about restoring and conserving our ocean areas. That means investing in low-cost, big-impact solutions like safeguarding marine and coastal habitats through well-implemented marine protected areas. According to a recent study in Science, climate-fueled ocean warming could kill off 1/3 of all marine animals over the next 300 years. And according to a separate study, climate change could lead to 10% of fish species becoming extinct this century. These serious losses would harm coastal economies, and we're already seeing some of these impacts in Florida. Just last year, a record number of manatees died, many from starvation. as man-made pollution killed off much of the seagrass that manatees feed on. And in Tampa Bay, red tide killed more than 600 tons of marine life and fish last summer, leaving a rotten smell that took over parts of our coast. But the good news is that we can mitigate these harms. And when it comes to ocean climate action, the Biden-Harris administration has hit the ground running. President Biden made the ocean a central part of his early executive order on climate, increasing American coordination with international partners and pledging to protect at least 30% of our waters by 2030. He also tasked the Ocean Policy Committee with drafting a national ocean climate action plan, and he's committed to produce 30 gigawatts of offshore wind energy by 2030. We've also done our part in Congress. Through President Biden's bipartisan infrastructure law, we invested over $490 million to restore ecosystems and prevent flood damage in coastal communities. Another $150 million to better gather data along our coast, the Great Lakes, and the ocean, and $490 million to improve NOAA's flood mapping, forecasting, and water modeling. Through our government funding legislation that we do every year, we also invested $33 million for NOAA's Coral Reef Program and $16 million for its ocean acidification program, as well as $21.5 million to address harmful algal blooms. Finally, the House did pass $6 billion in reconciliation investments for coastal and marine habitat restoration, and we urge our Senate colleagues to include those investments as they finalize the reconciliation legislation. So it's time to turn the tide for ocean climate action, and I look forward to today's discussion. I know my partner here, the ranking member, Representative Graves, agrees about the importance of our ocean resources, and I'm happy to recognize him for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks for being here today and hosting the hearing. And I want to thank y'all for being here. And let me explain why. This issue on climate has been this issue that's just been really political and really volatile now for a number of years. And the thing is that if we don't get it right, you're going to be the ones that inherit the problems, right? You are. You're going to be the ones that deal with our irresponsible actions, our politicizing something that should just be fact and science-based. And so we've got to get it right. And what's especially concerning is the area that I represent, South Louisiana. We have one of the some of the fastest subsidence rates in the world, or sinking rates in the world. We have some of the most gradual slopes, and so every inch of relative sea rise causes a pretty extraordinary impact. And just to put things in perspective, and I know Secretary Medina knows as well, we've lost about 2,000 square miles of our coast. That's like taking the state of Rhode Island and just wiping it off the map entirely. But what's happened with this issue is it's just become this big political thing. We have people out there saying all these things that are completely untrue, that are causing people to create false narratives and then act on them. And so let me give you a few examples. So number one, you have people out there that are touting things like Paris Climate Accords and saying that these things are going to end up being the saving grace. Well, I'll give you a little factoid. Under Paris Climate Accords, emissions for the globe are actually going to go up, not down. They're going to go up. And specifically, I want to call out one country, and I know Secretary Medina is going to talk about this, but China. The country of China right now, if I remember this right, they're emitting more than the United States, European Union, South Korea, and Japan, I think, combined. And under their commitments to the Paris Accords, they get to increase another 50% between now and 2030. 50%. So think for just a minute. In the United States, we can be leading the world. We can be leading the world in reducing emissions, but the reality is the environment's agnostic as to which country reduces emissions the most. It happens, what matters is whether we have a net downward trajectory. And the reality is that for every 1 ton of emissions the U.S. has reduced, China's actually gone up by 4. For every 1 ton we've reduced, China's increased by 4. If we're going to extract any lessons learned from what's happened with Russia's aggression into Ukraine, it needs to be the fact that you have leaders like Vladimir Putin and Xi in China and Kim in North Korea and Iran and leaders around the world. They don't care about international norms. They don't care about standards or rules. They don't care. They're going to do whatever they want. And they're never going to do things that undermine their economic best interests. They're not. And so for us to go out and pursue, and as the chair mentioned costly fossil fuels. Well, I remind you, gasoline prices have gone up over 100% over the past year and a half. Natural gas prices have gone up over 300% over the last year and a half. The Biden administration's made it very clear that we're going to have an increased demand for fossil fuels. We're going to have an increased demand for natural gas. We're going to have an increased demand for gasoline, for oil. The chair is exactly right. We're going to need absolutely every energy source, the ones that she's mentioned. We're going to need solar and wind. We're going to need wave and geothermal. We're going to need hydro. We're going to need nuclear. We're going to need all of it because according to the Biden administration, there's going to be a 50% increase in global energy demand. 50%. And so we're going to need every energy source we can. The Biden administration has also said that developing countries are going to need up to an 80% increase in natural gas. So if the globe, developing countries. So if we need an 80% increase in natural gas, why in the world would we not get it from the place that has it the cleanest in the world? You know what that is? That's the United States. In fact, it's in our offshore. So we can continue going down these pathways that make no sense, that aren't based in science, that aren't based in data, that continue the trajectory of this administration that's actually seen emissions go up, not down. I'll tell you a secret. Under the previous administration, emissions went down 2.5% a year. Under this administration, they've gone up 6.3% in 1 year. Okay? So we can deal with facts, or we can create false narratives and then pursue solutions based on things that are completely untrue. And if we continue doing that, guess whose problem it becomes? Yours. So I'm looking forward to this panel today. My daughter and I went fishing in the Gulf of Mexico this weekend. She nailed a 18-pound red snapper, almost 30-pound gag grouper, a good lane snapper. I mean, she was nailing them. We love fishing. We love the Gulf of Mexico and those resources. We must protect them, but we've got to make sure that we're using rational science. And I want to thank this committee's first government witnesses from ever coming since our existence. We appreciate you being here.
Okay, now I want to welcome our witnesses. Today we will hear from two Biden administration officials on the importance of ocean-based solutions in addressing the climate crisis. And they are not the first government witnesses to appear here, just to make sure the record's clear on that. Dr. Richard Spinrad is the Undersecretary of Commerce for Oceans and Atmosphere and NOAA Administrator. Dr. Spinrad is responsible for the strategic direction and oversight of NOAA, including its mission to understand and predict changes in climate, weather, ocean, and coast, as well as helping conserve and manage coastal and marine ecosystems and resources. He previously served as NOAA's chief scientist under President Obama and led NOAA's Office of Oceanic and Atmospheric Research and the National Ocean Service. Welcome. And Ms. Monica Medina is the Assistant Secretary of State for Oceans and International Environment and Scientific Affairs. Assistant Secretary Medina and her team provide leadership to conserve and protect the global environment and ocean. Prior to this role, Assistant Secretary Medina was an adjunct professor at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service, a former Principal Deputy Undersecretary of Commerce for Oceans and Atmosphere, and General Counsel of NOAA, and a Special Assistant to the Secretary of Defense. Welcome. We are so excited to have you both here, and without objection, the witnesses' opening statements will be made part of the record. With that, Dr. Spinrad, you are recognized for 5 minutes to provide your testimony.
Thank you, Chair Castor, Ranking Member Graves, members of the Select Committee. I really appreciate the opportunity to testify on NOAA's work to turn the tide for ocean climate action, and I'm pleased to join you during National Ocean Month and Capitol Hill Ocean Week, a time when we all join together to focus on the importance of our oceans and Great Lakes and the communities that rely on them, something that we at NOAA do every day. I'm also excited to be teaming up again with my former NOAA colleague, Assistant Secretary of State Monica Medina, on these critical issues. Now, more than ever, it's crucial that we're united in confronting these challenges on both the domestic and the global fronts. The oceans play a fundamental role in supporting life on our planet, affecting everything from the air we breathe and the food we eat to weather and climate patterns. Our well-being is intrinsically linked to the health of the oceans. NOAA's mission to support healthy oceans requires observations, research, modeling, prediction, and science-based stewardship of ocean resources. As the federal authoritative source on climate information, NOAA is working to build a climate-ready nation by 2030. This means a nation that loses fewer lives and incurs less damage when extreme weather strikes. Using NOAA's data, products, and services, our nation will improve its collective understanding of climate change, both to mitigate its impacts and help ensure we are resilient in the face of the climate threats we cannot avoid. With our stakeholders, other federal agencies, the private sector, philanthropy, academia, and the international community, we are focusing on actions on addressing the climate risks of extreme heat, drought, fire, flooding, sea level rise, and other extreme events, all serious realities that you and your constituents experience every day. NOAA is here to help. Through the Department of Commerce's Climate Action Plan, the Departmental Order on Addressing the Climate Crisis, and NOAA's own Climate Council, we're working diligently to address these concerns and integrate them into planning and policies to instill meaningful change. But we're not just providing data to scientists and industry. To truly prepare our nation to be climate ready, we know that it's critical to engage early, often, and meaningfully with the rural, tribal, marginalized, and historically underserved and vulnerable communities that need the most help to build resilience against climate change. To expand our reach, NOAA is forging partnerships with entities like the American Medical Association, the American Bar Association, the National Association of Realtors. We're engaging through our climate and equity roundtables, as well as our private sector climate listening sessions, to make sure we are meeting the needs and the co-developing smart, sustainable principles for the public-private partnerships necessary to deliver climate services. We're working in all of the United States, including with Native communities, to provide them with the products and services that they need. We want to ensure all decision makers are empowered to take action and make science-based decisions in the face of climate change. NOAA is actively working to remove barriers and expand equitable access to our tools, resources, and services to those on the front lines. We're funding climate and equity pilot projects co-developed with communities based on feedback received during these roundtables. The bipartisan infrastructure law, thank you, provides NOAA with nearly $3 billion, two-thirds of which is focused on coastal resilience and habitat restoration. And NOAA's fiscal year 23 President's budget request includes nearly $200 million in new climate research, tools, and services. There's a significant increase in demand for climate services across all regions and sectors, and these investments will not only help expand and improve NOAA's service delivery to build a climate-ready nation, but also prove and provide new and long-lasting economic opportunities to all communities. As NOAA works to address the impacts of climate change, we're also leading the administration priorities to map 30% of our coasts and oceans, protect 30% of our land and water, and deploy 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. NOAA has a memorandum of understanding with the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, which will prepare us to reach our offshore wind goals and minimize the impacts on ecosystems. We're also expanding our network of marine and estuarine protected areas, enhancing our resilience, sequestering carbon, and protecting biodiversity. In May, NOAA's Mauna Loa Atmospheric Baseline Observatory recorded carbon dioxide levels not seen on this planet for over 4 million years. The last time CO2 levels were this high, sea levels were high enough to drown most of the world's modern major cities. The time to act on climate change is now, and NOAA will continue to lead the way in understanding and taking action to address the climate crisis and build a climate-ready nation. We look forward to continuing to work alongside our federal partners, including the Department of State, to do so. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and I do look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, Assistant Secretary Medina, welcome. You're recognized for 5 minutes to provide your testimony.
Get this right. Thank you. Thank you, Chairwoman Castor, Ranking Member Graves, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify on this important issue of protecting the ocean and on its significance in the climate crisis. Thank you especially for the timing of this hearing. Yesterday was World Ocean Day, a day that is celebrated around the world. And here in the US, it's Capitol Hill Ocean Week. It's a perfect time to have this conversation. My name is Monica Medina, and I'm the Assistant Secretary for Oceans and International Environmental and Scientific Affairs at the State Department. Our Bureau leads U.S. efforts to conserve and protect the global environment, including the ocean, for the prosperity, peace, health, and security of this and future generations, like the ones who are sitting over there. I, too, am worried about the ocean and the climate impacts on it. The statistics you shared are daunting and deserve our attention in government, even as we deal with all the other crises in front of us. The ocean bears the brunt of climate change, with tremendous implications for the U.S.'s economic interests and global security. Communities are already being strained by the effects of climate change on our ocean, including food shortages, severe storms, coastal inundation, growing dead zones, and escalating conflicts around shifting or dwindling ocean resources. Climate change is happening today and exacerbating every other challenge we face. Leaders I have talked to around the world want to work with the U.S. to address climate challenges. These are existential threats, and though they seem localized, the ripple effects are felt worldwide, from food shortages to mass migrations. And these countries are being aggressively wooed by our competitors. But our competitors do not offer these countries the sustainable solutions they need. By contrast, the United States is deploying our expertise from across the government to build the capacity of our international partners to deal with the climate challenges they face. And I want to thank Congress for the funding that you've provided for the work that we're doing. We must work with our allies to build more secure, climate-resilient world. We are the partner of choice for the impacted nations, and the more we help them, the stronger we will be as a nation. In my testimony today, I'd like to highlight 3 ways in which the United States is working globally to combat the ocean climate crisis and the implications of that work for our security. First, we can help other countries see what's coming. The United States is a global leader in climate forecasting and observing, as Dr. Spinrad has so well explained. We support capacity building efforts around the world to help other countries improve their ocean observing systems and to support scientists in the collection of globally shared data that's critical for our weather forecasts and models. This vast data collection effort, undertaken largely through the work of my colleague at NOAA, has informed the development of climate and ocean models that are helping to better predict and prepare for how we deal with a changing climate and how that impacts communities, both here at home and around the globe. Second, we can help those countries prepare based on that information. The United States has enormous technical capacity and expertise to apply those forecasts to assist other countries. Sharing this expertise can strengthen our alliances and help build a better world. Supporting international partners as they adapt and build resilience will be critical for promoting security and stability at home and abroad. The President's Emergency Plan for Adaptation and Resilience, or PREPARE, seeks to help more than 500 million people in developing countries adapt to and manage the impacts of severe storms, droughts, and sea level rise. We are also working to protect the health and productivity of marine ecosystems by taking action to promote maritime security and stop illegal fishing. And we plan to increase our collaboration with our Atlantic and Pacific neighbors to solve common challenges and seize opportunities to develop sustainable blue economies. The third we can do is help with the solutions that prevent the climate crisis's worst impacts from happening. The United States is taking an active role in galvanizing these ocean-based climate solutions. These include protecting and restoring coastal ecosystems, expanding offshore and renewable energy, and decarbonizing the shipping sector, to name a few. In sum, the steps we take today to address and adapt to climate change are critical to American security and global stability for generations to come. This is the year to turn the tide on oceans, to tackle these challenges and make investments needed to ensure that our oceans are central to solving the climate crisis. From the Our Ocean Conference that we co-hosted with Palau in April, to the upcoming UN Ocean Conference, to the Convention on Biological Diversity meeting, to COP27 in Egypt. This year, the United States has many opportunities to position ourselves as a global leader on ocean climate issues, to support our partners as they seek sustainable solutions to ocean challenges, and to pursue the bold steps we need to stop the decline of our oceans. This is our chance to work together with our partners around the world to build a future for our children and grandchildren that is in harmony with the ocean and free from conflict. And if we act now, we can achieve a healthy ocean that will continue to meet their needs for the foreseeable future, which is surely the future we would like to see. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. I'll recognize myself first for 5 minutes to start the questioning. You know, we're very fortunate to have an administration like the Biden-Harris administration that is bringing every tool to the table to help protect our oceans. So let's talk about some of the tools that you have. You talked a little bit about the bipartisan infrastructure law that will provide significant resources to help keep our oceans resilient. There are different resources all across America. So would you go into a little more depth on the tools, your priorities out of those new bipartisan infrastructure law investments? And then just yesterday, you announced an Ocean Climate Action Plan. How do those interact together to the administrator to help protect our oceans and allow us to become more resilient?
Thank you, Chair Castor. There's a lot going on. I appreciate your comment about the role of the Biden-Harris administration. On a little bit of a sidebar, I came out of retirement to take this job because I was so compelled by some of what I was hearing about what this administration wanted to do in moving forward. And I was also very much encouraged when I saw action up here on the Hill, especially as it manifested in the bipartisan infrastructure law, focused on these specific issues. So what kinds of tools? Well, obviously, in the bipartisan infrastructure law, we see, in NOAA's case, close to $1.4 billion dedicated to coastal resilience, which is a direct application of resources to adaptation to what we know is already happening. So while we can mitigate and we can start addressing decarbonizing and renewables, we know sea level rise, ocean acidification are happening right now. What do we do about that? So we will be issuing funding opportunity announcements for competitive bids around the country for local communities, jurisdictions, tribes, to invest those resources to harden their coasts, to make their coasts more resilient through any number of actions. It's something we've done before, but we've never had these kinds of resources to build that sort of resilient coastal activity. That's not enough. We also need to make sure that those scientific capabilities and the products of our science that come out of our labs and our work with academic researchers are made available to decision makers, and local emergency managers, local community planners, tribes. And so we are building mechanisms for dissemination of the data, whether it be through web portals or using our boots on the ground through Sea Grant, for example, to make sure information about what climate impacts will be can be shared with those communities. And the last part is, part of the investment that we're seeing is going to go to the nuts and bolts, if you will, of being able to build better forecasts and better models. So high performance computing, which allows us to actually zero in and provide improved seasonal outlooks. And that's not obviously limited to coastal applications. I had a discussion with a member of Congress who is a fifth-generation farmer who wanted a better seasonal outlook of precipitation. So our ability to build better models with more high-performance computing is another aspect of that. And with respect to the action plan that you alluded to, the Climate Action Plan, this is a team sport. NOAA has a leading role, as I indicated, but we work very closely with our colleagues in Department of Interior, Energy, NASA, National Science Foundation, State Department, obviously. And so through the auspices of the Climate Policy Office, as well as the Office of Science and Technology Policy, we're making sure we all understand the coordination of our efforts in the plan and also the leveraging and the complementary nature of what we do.
That's terrific. The resilience and adaptation, we have to do it. We've waited too long to decarbonize. But I'm so worried about the oceans. And my local economy in the Tampa Bay area and the state of Florida is directly tied to clean water. But with the highest concentrations of carbon pollution in the atmosphere, the stresses on marine life, the impact to corals, we have got to move to clean energy. I mean, it is more plain than ever. We cannot throw up our hands and say, oh, it's too hard, or other countries aren't doing their job. We are the world leader. So can you talk about, maybe Assistant Secretary, what we are doing to help rally the global community to reduce carbon pollution so we don't have to focus totally on pouring billions and billions and billions of dollars into resilience and adaptation, that we're really moving to the clean energy economy over time?
Of course, Chairwoman, the administration's policy on this is set by Special Presidential Envoy Kerry, the global policy, and I work very closely with his office. We share a lot of staff members who actually work for both of us. They're working very hard on clean energy and on dealing with the major emitting countries and helping them to see the need to make this kind of transition that Ranking Member Graves talked about, the need for those countries to turn their energy systems around and to be more innovative, to rely more and more and more and more on renewable energy. But in my work, I focus tremendously on nature-based solutions, and that's where the ocean comes in, and where I think we can work much more closely with scientists and other nations to find those ocean solutions, whether it's wind energy, and we know the value of wind energy is only going up here in the US. We've seen how those wind energy leases are really taking off, and we know that there's tremendous potential. We could basically, you know.
I think we're going to talk more about it. I'm over time with my question. So thank you. To be continued. Ranking Member Graves, you're recognized for 5 minutes. Oh, Mr. Gonzalez, good morning. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning. Thank you, Chairwoman Castor and Ranking Member Graves, for holding this hearing today, and to our witnesses for joining us and sharing your testimonies. Secretary Medina, I'm going to start with you. While marine litter and climate change have commonly been treated as two separate issues, there's a growing recognition of their interconnectedness. As I'm sure you know, when plastics end up in the ocean and start breaking down, they release greenhouse gases as well as affect the ability of organisms to grow, reproduce, and capture carbon. Latest set of data from the World Bank indicates that 8 million tons of plastic are leaked into the ocean each year, which is the equivalent of dumping the contents of a garbage truck in the ocean roughly every minute. It seems obvious to all of us here that we need to take steps to incorporate more circular economy principles and take action to reduce waste we've currently built up in the ocean. That being said, what efforts can lawmakers take to accelerate innovation in the recycling space and reduce plastic leaks into the ocean?
Thank you so much for this question. It's one, I spend an awful lot of my time on. Plastic pollution is one of my priorities, not only because it ends up in the ocean, which is a terrible problem. In my data, I have a different fact, and it's even more alarming. 14 million tons ends up in the ocean. We could quibble. It's way too much.
More than 1 million.
More, yes. Yeah. Way too much. We're drowning in plastic. We know we need to do something differently, which is why I'm so pleased to say that the United States is playing a leading role in creating the new global agreement we need. And industry is actually right with us, along with the environmental community, to try to change the way the world deals with plastic pollution. This agreement that we just decided to launch the negotiation of hopefully will be concluded in the next 2 years. And we will, under this agreement, allow nations to create ambitious action plans of their own. No one-size-fits-all solutions. An island nation might need something different than a big country, big land-based country like ourselves. But if we work hard together to spur innovation from industry, to drive that change, I'm convinced that we can find the solutions that we need to actually stem this terrible scourge of plastic pollution, and we have to do it now. We could always use more resources to do that, to try and help spur that innovation, to help smaller countries that don't have the capacity to do that work. But I think industry will have to play a huge role, and we're counting on them to do it, and I think they're ready to step up and help us.
Switching gears a bit, recent years has been a resurgence in interest in offshore wind. But despite the low carbon and economic benefits that offshore wind can bring, there are real concerns on long-term turbine performance, specifically the high operating costs and reduced economic lifetimes. As Europe's experience with offshore wind has demonstrated, large turbine technologies suffer from reliability and maintenance issues, causing the amount of electricity generated to decline by almost half over 10 years. Unsurprisingly, the revenues and profitability of these facilities diminishes rapidly, leading developers to abandon the projects before the term of their power purchase agreement. Moreover, offshore wind means more demand for rare earth elements, which historically come from China. With increased demand likely triggering higher production costs, it's difficult to imagine a world in which ratepayers are left unharmed. With the administration setting a goal of 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030, can you provide some insight into how these concerns will be addressed and ratepayers will be protected?
This one's to me.
Yes.
So, Congressman, I'm not the domestic energy expert. I'm at the State Department, and energy isn't squarely in my remit, but I take the point that we need to continue to improve technologies, and wind is a big part of the solution, and we need offshore wind. We also need solar. We need all the renewable energies we can muster, and that's what will help ratepayers.
Well, let me ask you from an international perspective then. So put your international hat on. How do we protect ratepayers globally if we're going to move into an offshore wind world with these cost concerns?
I think we continue to improve the technology so that we can have renewable energy for ourselves, and we don't have to worry about price spikes and perturbations caused by other countries.
Is it your belief that we can do this, and from a cost standpoint to consumers, there will be no harm? I
believe, just like President Biden, that when we, the American people, put our minds to something, we can get it done. If we can put a man or a rover on Mars, I believe we can solve these challenges as well.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Next up, Representative Huffman, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Castor. And just a few words about my friend from Louisiana's opening remarks. I actually got my hopes up when I heard him describe these terrible impacts of the climate crisis that are coming. We know they're coming. We know what they're going to do to places like South Louisiana. And he then described a duty to future generations, which I found very heartening and encouraging, saying that we need to overcome politics and confront this crisis for the sake of preserving a livable planet for these guys. Unfortunately, it went downhill pretty quickly from there. We started hearing the same old excuses that China is a bigger emitter than us, and therefore we can't focus on emissions until we get China in line, and that somehow our fossil fuels are cleaner than the Russians and the Saudis, and therefore we ought to just crank it up and go out there and meet all of this global energy demand with our fossil fuels, which are cleaner, which are really less bad than the really bad. And unfortunately, that's like saying never mind to all of that good stuff about the climate crisis, to all of these nice words about your generation, folks. It's like saying never mind. We've got money to make. We've got oil to sell. And that's politics. So if we're serious about overcoming politics and doing the right thing to preserve the planet for the younger generation, leading a global fossil fuel race to the bottom cannot be the answer. Now, on this subject of our oceans, and Chair Castor, I'm so glad that we're focusing on this. I'd like to start my questions on fisheries, which is something I've been working a lot on. So Dr. Spinrad, I'll begin with you. I did a national listening tour because I've been working on legislation to reauthorize the Magnuson Act. Everywhere I went, every region of the country, I heard how climate change is already impacting fisheries, whether it's shifting stocks or habitat changes or acute disruptions like fisheries disasters. It is here and now, and yet our institutions were developed at a time when we weren't really thinking about any of that. And some of the more commercially important fish species, in fact, are moving north to find cooler water. This creates all kinds of conflicts between regional councils, maybe between us and Canada and Mexico in some cases. So it's a whole new world of fishery management that this climate crisis is presenting us with. And I wondered if you could just speak broadly to what NOAA is doing so far to address these changes in fisheries management, and what resources do you need to meet the moment?
Thank you, Congressman Huffman. This is a very serious issue and one we're applying a lot of resources and a lot of attention to from a number of different perspectives. As a scientific agency, as an environmental intelligence agency, what we're trying to do is not dissimilar to the way our national security community looks at is how will things change in the future and can we position ourselves to deal with that? So we have an investment in what we call the Climate Ecosystems and Fisheries Initiative, which really asks how are, for example, Alaskan pollock becoming Russian pollock? What is happening to the lobstering industry and where are those lobsters going to go? What will change due to our best, in the context of our best knowledge? So just as we try to develop predictions and forecasts of atmospheric and weather phenomena, we're trying to do the same thing with all species in this initiative. The other part of this, of course, is a redoubled effort to take advantage of the extraordinary traditional knowledge that we have around the country. Generations of fishers, generations of local communities have knowledge about the patterns that they've seen over the last few years. We're trying to, if you will, quantify that, do a QA, QC on those kind of data to incorporate those in our predictive capabilities and co-develop the policies associated with what will our fisheries community look like. And we need industry involved in this discussion as well. So we've been doing similar roundtables to yours. I would add there's another angle on this as well, and that is, we have established aquaculture opportunity areas, and we are looking at how might that, what is the art of the possible associated with really doing this in a sustainable, economically viable manner. So we're developing the initial environmental impact statements associated with those, and hope that that's part of the solution as well.
I don't have much time left, but Assistant Secretary Medina, I would love to hear from you how you are working with other countries to manage essential fisheries in the face of the climate crisis.
Thank you, Congressman. There is a huge problem here. 23% of fish stocks are predicted to shift from their historical migration routes and habitats by 2030. That's an awful lot of people whose food source is going to move somewhere else immediately, and that's a recipe for crisis and for conflict. So we are working with the Food and Agricultural Organization to increase technical assistance, to build climate-ready fisheries management, and hopefully with better forecasting of these kinds of shifts and migrations from agencies like NOAA, and with our partners at USAID, we can take those forecasts and aim our assistance right where we need it.
All right, thanks. I yield back.
Rep. Palmer, you're recognized for 5 minutes. Good morning. Representative Miller, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and Ranking Member Graves, and thank you both for being here today. I represent West Virginia, which is a landlocked state. But we all know that the world's oceans impact all of us, from natural challenges, changes in weather patterns, man-made circumstances, even our supply chain and the difficulties we're having internationally, because we're all affected by the oceans. That's why America, acting alone with few close allies, cannot tackle this challenge single-handedly. Carbon emissions do not recognize borders or stay within their country of origin. The developing world has questioned why countries like the United States and Europe and China have been allowed to develop because of our vast use of natural resources and traditional energy, and why they have to remain in poverty to serve our interests. The quickest way to bring developing countries into modern economy is to allow them to utilize their own energy assets and to help scale the technologies to tackle the real problem, which is carbon emissions. Vilifying natural resources and sources of energy, like this administration has done constantly, excuse me, Madam Chair? Excuse me? Vilifying our natural sources of energy, like this administration has done constantly, will only breed resentment around the world on their stage, raising prices for consumers here at home and leave American security at the whims of authoritarian foreign governments. We don't want to repeat the mistakes of our European allies who traded cheap energy from Putin in exchange for their security. If our goal is to tackle the rise in sea levels, the way to do that is by lowering carbon emissions, and we should be researching and funding transformative technologies that curb emissions while still using the sources of energies that provides the vast majority of our power. By scaling down these technologies here at home, we can further export it across the world, creating goodwill and a prosperous global economy in the shortest amount of time possible. Our government should be investing to ensure the continued clean use of all types of energy, and yes, that does include coal, oil, and natural gas. Madam Chair, I have been reading this book by Professor Coonan, who has served as Undersecretary for Science under the Obama administration. In it, he provides a robust discussion on the climate alarmism that has gripped our politics, our media, and our culture. And in a chapter on sea level rise, Mr. Kunin says, in summary, we don't know how much of the rise in global sea levels is due to human-caused warming and how much is a product of long-term natural cycles. So it's time to stop the alarmism and name-calling and bickering and come together to find a real solution. Ms. Medina, as your testimony notes, the challenge of sea level rise and the challenges of adaptation in the developing world are something that we are all concerned about. Given that the U.S. is among the most environmentally efficient producers in the world, how important is it that we look to efficient producers to power the globe, which will then lead to greater energy security, lower global emissions, and greater environmental outcomes?
Thank you, Congresswoman, for that question. I think there's a lot in what you've said that we agree with. America cannot tackle this problem alone. We must lower carbon emissions, and we have to rapidly scale innovative technology. And what I think developing countries, particularly small island developing countries, need is the energy supply that will work for them. And so we go and we listen to countries and we ask them what they want and what they need, and importing expensive oil and gas may not be the right solution for them. And so we look at programs that will meet their needs, that will address their demands for energy, but also their desire to be part of the climate solution. What I hear over and over again from those countries is, let us help be part of the climate solution, invest in ocean conservation in our big ocean areas, and let us help the rest of the world make up for the damage that it's causing.
Thank you. In your testimony, you also mentioned the role of our country is to serve as a partner to other nations. Could you expand on that and what you believe the administration sees as its role on partnering with other countries to ensure stable and consistent energy supply through all of the above strategy, especially given the energy crisis the whole world is facing today?
And
Congresswoman, thank you for that question. What I said in an earlier answer is that I'm not the energy expert. There is another bureau within the State Department that governs energy policy. But what I can tell you about what we're doing to work cooperatively is rebuilding partnerships and allies with alliances with countries all over the world. And I'll just give one quick example. Yesterday at the Summit of the Americas, we signed an MOU with the governments of Costa Rica, Panama, Ecuador, and Colombia to help them conserve some of the most precious ocean spaces on the planet, the Galapagos Islands. What could be more important? Our work is to help them become more able to conserve the resources that they have, and we're going to work together across the federal government with our federal interagency partners to bring that kind of American expertise to help other countries work together to solve their ocean issues.
Thank you. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Representative Caston, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks to our speakers for coming here. And thanks to all the young folks who are here. I really appreciate you coming out here. And I hope you will continue to be active in this space. A number of years ago, 2 years ago, when the United States pulled out of the Paris Climate Accord, there were about a dozen of us who went over to Madrid to basically let the world know that even though the United States government, which was the only country that had pulled out, that we were going to go and tell the world we're still in. And I remember one of our European colleagues pulled us aside and said, we just want you to know that really bad things happen when the United States doesn't lead. That carried a lot of weight, obviously, with the history of Europe, but I hope you will keep that in mind as you think about your own futures, because notwithstanding our ranking member's advice that we shouldn't act until China acts, it is important that the United States leads. Dr. Spinrad, I want to chat with you a little bit about ocean modeling and methane. I'm on the science committee. We just saw this report about how the oil and gas industry is not reporting all of the methane emissions that they're producing. I'm, of course, as we all are, I think, petrified about this 84x multiplier on global warming relative to CO2. The global methane pledge that came out of the Glasgow meetings was a key part to making sure that we actually do keep 1.5 alive, as they say. And we're focused a lot on the private sources of methane, but as I look at the geological history of the world, there's, as you know well, there's this Paleocene, Eocene border where there's some suggestion that maybe the warming of the upper surface of the ocean led to these huge burps of methane hydrates underneath. We have seen some releases. I believe Alaska, the University of Alaska Fairbanks saw some significant releases in the East Siberian Sea, if I have that right. I'm wondering if you can share to what degree you believe we've got a good model of the oceans to understand as we're injecting this heat into the upper surface of the ocean, should we have concerns about intermixing, releasing some of those clathrates out? Do we need more research there? Help me understand how big a deal that is. Should we be concerned about it and what we can do to mitigate some of the effects, if any?
Yeah, thank you, Congressman. I think that is a, excuse me, a critical issue, and I was delighted, quite honestly, in Glasgow that this was elevated to an issue of global concern. At NOAA, we look at it from a few perspectives. You've alluded to the modeling piece of it, but there is an equally important observational component. So talking about the Alaska release is just one piece. We have recently conducted through our ocean exploration program a number of studies off the east coast of the United States where we have seen more venting of methane than we had expected to see before. It's not right now an inherently modelable phenomenon. We first need to understand where are the sources. What are the sources, the natural sources of methane emitting in these undersea vents? So our ocean exploration program is a critical component of that. Once we have an understanding of the sorts of concentrations and the distribution of the vent sources, or the methane sources, then we can build that component as one of the greenhouse gas elements into the forecasts for changes in temperature, the results of having that methane in the atmosphere. You're absolutely right, a greater than 80% greenhouse gas impact. If you will, the silver lining, if there is one, is that it's a much, much more short-lived component in the greenhouse gas constituency. So we do have the models. We can take the information. Once we've got the data from the observational capabilities, we can get a much better handle on what the downstream implications are for global warming.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong, but if we release all those clathrates, I think we are also short-lived. The last time you and I spoke, I think you just released this report saying that the sea level rise on the Gulf Coast was going to be 2 feet by 2050. With high degree of certainty, appropriate scientific qualifiers on that. And I sit on the Financial Services Committee, and a few weeks later we had Chairman Powell before us, and I shared your testimony with him, and I said, okay, so if I buy a home on the Gulf Coast of Louisiana today, that house is going to be underwater before the mortgage is paid off. And are we changing the way that Fannie and Freddie allocate risks accordingly? And his comment was no, but we probably should. I wonder if you could share to what degree you're working on an interagency basis to make sure that across all of our other agencies that are directly affected by what you're doing, and how can we help elevate that or make sure that we don't have to have any more of those conversations saying yes, but we should.
Yeah, thank you, Congressman. That is a subject that is near and dear to my heart, and one which I've undertaken some very specific actions on. At NOAA, I established a NOAA Climate Council initially to coordinate our internal activities between the Fishery Service and the Weather Service and the Ocean Service, but we quickly realized there was an external-facing role we could play. So I have begun serious dialogues with the Department of Treasury, Department of Transportation, Department of Energy, FAA, any number of those components of the federal government that have policy and operational responsibilities for economic security, for example. We are also working with industry. The reinsurance and insurance industry is closely coupled. I'll be talking to the reinsurance industry next week about these issues. So we're trying to work both the interagency piece by talking to Treasury and the other related departments, as well as the industry component. And of course, we work with local communities.
Okay. I see I'm out of time, and be gracious, thank you. I'd love to work through more. I yield back.
Thank you.
Representative Palmer, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I thank the witnesses. I have a question, and I really want the young people here to answer this mentally anyway, but has the Sahara always been a desert? Dr. Spinrad?
I was going to ask the younger people.
Well,
I think, depending on how you define always, obviously, if we go back in geological
no,
time,
I'm asking you, has it always been a desert? It either has or it hasn't.
I'm sure in geological time there was a period when it was not.
How long ago was that?
I don't know the answer to that.
How about you?
I'm not a scientist. I wouldn't hazard a guess. I
You're
wouldn't
not
know
a
at all.
scientist?
No.
Most of the people asking questions here aren't either. The answer is the Sahara was a lush area populated by the Nubian and Egyptian cultures. There's farming, there were lakes and rivers and streams, and it was only about 5,000 years ago. I mean, a literal blink in geologic time. It started becoming a desert somewhere between 10 and 12,000 years ago. Again, a literal blink in geologic time. This is important for you to understand this because there are decisions being made based on climate science. It's based on models that the vast majority of the models are totally inaccurate. They have to manipulate the models to get to some of the conclusions that they draw. And as a result, your parents and you are paying $6, $7, $8 a gallon for gas. You're going to be paying that for a gallon of milk, for a loaf of bread. We're experiencing highest inflation we've seen in 40 years. There are consequences for the decisions that are being made by my colleagues in Congress and by the Biden administration. And I understand that the climate's changing, and the reason I bring up the Sahara Desert, because that's an example of climate change. And I know you won't know the answer if I ask you what caused that, but most scientists believe it's because the Earth changed its tilt on its axis. And as a result, the wind patterns changed, and over time, the Sahara became a desert. Now, like I said, they're excavating Nubian and Egyptian settlements there. You've got the archaeological data to look at. And what I like to point out to people is if the Nubians and Egyptians had the same desalinization technology and irrigation technology that Israel uses today, there'd still be people living in the Sahara, farming and you know, playing sports, driving cars. I know that drives my friends crazy, but we need to be talking about adaptation and mitigation. And Chairman Castor, I'm going to admit something. It's hard for me to do, but human activity actually has had an impact on tropical storms in the Atlantic. And it's a study from NOAA that indicates that the reduction of particulate air pollution in Europe and North America has contributed to an increase in the number of tropical cyclones in the North Atlantic. Isn't that interesting that we've cleaned up the air and it's resulted in more storms? So human activity does impact the climate. But what I know you brought these young people in here for a reason. I want you to understand that there's more to the story than you're getting. I highly recommend a book by Dr. Kristen Peters, PhD from Harvard, a geologist. It's called The Whole Story of Climate. And you need to understand this, and my colleague from mentioned sea level rise and the potential of them buying a home in Louisiana. And I know my colleague, Mr. Graves, would really encourage that. But during the Eemian period, we're right at the end of the Holocene period, or what's known as the subatlantic period. But during the Eemian period, it was considerably warmer. And you look at the geologic evidence, and you can see there are higher concentrations of CO2, higher concentrations of methane, as you've pointed out. But during that period, the shoreline in Georgia, North Carolina was about 50 miles further inland and about 120 feet higher. 2/3 of Alabama was underwater. All of Florida was underwater. Most of Louisiana was underwater. A huge portion of Texas, all the way up into Oklahoma and into the Midwest, was underwater because the climate changed. It changed again. The sea levels receded. There's a whole lot more to this than what you're being told, and I highly encourage you to take the time to study this for yourself. Get the whole story. I yield back.
Next up, Representative Brownlee is here virtually. You're recognized for 5 minutes for your question.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks to the witnesses for being here today. Administrator Spinrad, I have been working with Representative Carbajal and Senators Feinstein and Padilla to support the designation of the Chumash heritage as the National Marine sanctuary. The proposed sanctuary, which was initiated by the Chumash, is the home of really the most biologically diverse and ecologically productive regions in the world. And so my question to you, if you could speak a little bit more to the work that you're doing around this, but even more importantly, how quickly are you addressing these expansions, and what are your goals around that?
Thank you, Congresswoman. And I really appreciate your drawing attention to the issue of development of marine protected areas. We were delighted. I was pleased, as one of my earliest acts as NOAA administrator, to initiate the designation of the Chumash Sanctuary. We have an inventory of these sanctuaries, or proposed sanctuaries. We added one yesterday to the inventory from Alaska. We also announced the initiation of designation of another sanctuary in the Hudson Canyon yesterday. So we are aggressively moving out the definition consistent with the America the Beautiful initiative of the Biden-Harris administration to conserve 30% of our lands and waters by 2030. The process is one which involves extensive engagement, as you well know, in the case of Chumash, with the local tribes, local communities, local industries, to define what the terms are. Not all sanctuaries, not all marine protected areas have the same terms of reference, if you will, or definitions of what activities can be conducted in those areas. So we have a portfolio, we have an inventory of these. Part of the restriction, if you will, or controlling factor, a rheostat, so to speak, is the resources that we have. The resources we get from Congress, so we thank Congress for your additional investments in sanctuary development, and also the people that we have that can process these. But another important component is the dynamic of working with our agency partners, especially, for example, within the Department of Interior, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. So when you look at all of those factors, over the course of several years, we will undergo a thorough analysis, public comment, and hopefully end up with the formal designation of the sanctuary in just a few years.
Thank you very much for that. And Secretary Medina, could you speak a little bit about what the international efforts are to support Indigenous and local people who are working to protect their local environments?
Yes, thank you for that question. It's one I very much appreciate because it is a big part of what we're doing at the State Department. We have been working hard with tribal governments and Indigenous peoples around the world to help lift up their efforts to adapt to climate change and understand better the nature of the threat that they're up against. We recognize that these people are have often been ignored or have been marginalized in the conversation globally. And I'm very pleased actually to have with me here the lead negotiator for the agreement, the Global Climate Agreement on Indigenous peoples. And so we are working very hard to further their interests, both in our bilateral foreign policy efforts with USAID and also within the confines of the agreement itself.
Terrific. Thank you very much. And Dr. Spinrad, in terms of partnering with other agencies, as you mentioned earlier, I know a few weeks ago, the Department of Interior announced next steps for and public comment on offshore wind lease sales in 2 regions offshore of California. Is NOAA involved in that process at all?
Yes, thank you for that. We work closely with our colleagues at the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, which has the responsibility for those lease sales and those lease activities. In fact, I've signed a memorandum of understanding with BOEM Director Amanda Levin, which includes any number of very specific activities regarding coordination of permitting, regarding coordination of release of information, and another interesting component is an agreement that we both have to exchange personnel so we can accelerate and optimize and make even better the processes that those who are bidding on the leases have to engage in. So I'm really excited about the progress we're making and what this will mean in terms of interest, certainly from the wind energy development, the energy development community in general.
Very good. I represent a port in my district, the Port of Hueneme, that's associated with Naval Base Ventura County. And I know they're very much interested in possibly participating as a hub for servicing wind turbines as this moves on. So thank you for that, Madam Chair, and I yield back.
Terrific. Next up, I'll go to Representative Carter, who represents a beautiful coastal district in Georgia. Rep. Carter, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank both of you for being here. As Chairperson Castor just mentioned, I have the honor and privilege of representing the entire coast of Georgia, over 100 miles of pristine coastline. I'm very proud of it. And I want to thank you. I want to thank NOAA, because you have done some great work in providing data about our coast, and that's extremely important. You know, I've always said in order to deal with climate change, we've got to do three things. We've got to have adaptation, mitigation, and innovation, and they are very important. Particularly on the coast, adaptation and mitigation are extremely important. Since 1980, the United States has spent $1.75 trillion in recovery from $258 billion events that we've experienced. From 2014 to 2018, the United States saw an average of $13 billion disasters every year. Those are staggering numbers. And, you know, there are a number, as I mentioned, a number of programs that NOAA's been involved with, that including the Integrated Ocean Observing System, the Digital Coast Sea Level Rise Viewer, and reports from Coastal Resilience grant programs that allow communities to recover and repair from storms. And this has allowed Georgia to recover, and it's truly allowed us to adapt to the climate. Adaptation, one of the things that we need to do. According to FEMA, no other coastal state besides Georgia has completed disaster recovery and redevelopment plans for every coastal county as we have. So I'd like to ask you, Mr. Spinrad, I'd like to ask you this. As you can see, these have been truly beneficial programs and these efforts. How is NOAA ensuring that local communities, especially smaller ones, get this information? And what does NOAA do to help them act on this valuable information?
Thank you, Congressman. I truly appreciate your recognition of the hard work that NOAA and our partners have undertaken, especially in the state that's home to one of our sanctuaries as well, and our attention to the issue of coastal resilience. So your question really gets down to, no matter how good you do in terms of developing products and services, how are they being implemented? How are they getting out to the communities? We have recognized that that service delivery piece, if you will, of our responsibility is one of the most important aspects. So we have boots on the ground capabilities like Sea Grant. We also are going to make extensive use of our service delivery mechanisms like the weather forecast offices more than we have in the past.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you for your fine work. Now, I want to get serious. How many hours in 2 days? You know the answer.
2 days, 48 hours.
48 hours. You know how many days of fishing for red snapper we get on the Atlantic coast?
Yeah.
How many?
Less than that, yeah.
2 days. We're going to get 2 days this year of fishing for red snapper. Now, on the Gulf, I was just told that they went from Memorial Day to Labor Day last year, and then they reopened the season because they still had plenty of red snapper. We get 2 days. Let me ask you, do you know who holds the club record at the Savannah Yacht Club for the biggest red snapper caught?
I do not, sir.
Do you know that I've got plans for these 2 days elsewhere? Now, I'm not going to be able to defend my record. 2 days. How can you justify 2 days for recreational fishing for red snapper? Right now, the most recent South Atlantic red snapper stock assessment indicated that the stock has shown progress toward rebuilding. There's an independent 30-month study that will help better understand the true stock of red snapper in the South Atlantic. This one is inspired by the Gulf of Mexico, as I just mentioned, by their great red snapper count, which discovered that there are 3 times as many red snappers previously estimated in the Gulf. What I want to ask you is, can you commit to NOAA using the results of this independent study to possibly inform management of the South Atlantic red snapper fishery?
So, thank you, sir. And I can commit to using all the best scientific data that we've got, including the results of that assessment, the red snapper count, as we look to ensure the highest quality of the assessment of what the stocks are of red snapper.
How did you come up with 2 days? I mean, if the wind's blowing, if it's raining, then we don't get anything. And you tell us the 2 days that we're going to get to fish. 2 days, 48 hours. I hope that we can use this study. I hope that we can make an accurate assessment of what exists out there. I went fishing in the Gulf of Mexico, and it happened, this was off of New Orleans, at Port Fourchon, a couple of years ago. I had to throw back 44 red snapper. Now, granted, I'm a pretty good fisherman, but at the same time, I had to throw back 44 red snapper. I don't know what y'all are doing and where you're coming up with this, but I hope that you will consider the recreational fishermen. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, sir.
Next up, we'll go to one of the leading advocates for ocean policy in the Congress, Representative Bonamici.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and Ranking Member Graves. Thank you to our witnesses, Dr. Spinrad. It's great to see you, another Oregonian in your position at NOAA, and thank you for being here today, as well as Assistant Secretary Medina. Thank you to the students for being here today as well. I hope you're finding this an informative and thought-provoking experience to be here. So I co-chair the House Oceans Caucus. Oh, thank you. Wrong button. I co-chair the House Oceans Caucus and the House Estuaries Caucus. So I'm deeply concerned about the climate crisis and how it's affecting our ocean, coastlines, and estuaries. Sea level rise, ocean acidification, hypoxic zones, harmful algal blooms are on the rise. I'm glad my colleague, Representative Miller, recognized that this affects not only people who represent coastline, like I do at the beautiful north coast of Oregon. Last year, I reintroduced my bipartisan Blue Carbon for Our Planet Act to enhance the research, protection, and restoration of blue carbon ecosystems, which has the potential to sequester carbon, but also to provide coastal resilience benefits. So Dr. Spinrad, in your testimony, you discussed how some countries are using blue carbon as a way of meeting their nationally determined contributions under the Paris Climate Accord. What can NOAA do to help put the U.S. on the same path, and how can blue carbon mapping help?
Thank you, Congresswoman. Good to see you as well. Blue carbon is a fascinating subject, and I think to start the discussion, we need to point out that it's only recently that we've recognized the role that blue carbon can play, the role that algae and seaweed and higher trophic levels can play in this. So the first thing we're trying to do is the inventory, if you will, the assessment of exactly what does constitute blue carbon. And one of the things I'm excited about is the initiative the White House announced just a couple of months ago about the natural capital inventory, to understand where is the carbon, how much of it is there. NOAA will play a critical role. We are the Environmental Intelligence Agency, so our efforts to assess and account for and also to predict the potential for the growth of blue carbon is going to be a major contribution that we make to that assessment.
Excellent. Well, the idea for the bill came from a visit to the Hatfield Marine Science Center, where I know you spent a significant amount of time. Dr. Spinrad, what efforts has NOAA undertaken to incorporate equity into decision-making? We know that data from NOAA and the Census Bureau indicates that vulnerable populations make up approximately 40% of coastal populations, and more than 1/3 of coastal communities are individuals from historically marginalized communities. So how are you incorporating that data, making sure that marginalized communities share in the economic benefits of the blue economy?
Thank you, Congresswoman. We're doing a number of things. I would say, in one word, what we're doing is listening, primarily engaging with communities that may not have had a voice in the dialogue in the past. So we conducted a series of 8 climate and equity roundtables around the country focused on geography, but also focused on themes, flooding, drought, extreme heat, and heard what the concerns were. And I would point out that these were not, if you will, your usual roundtables. We involved faith-based communities, we involved underrepresented, underserved, vulnerable communities, and we are now taking the results of those roundtables and building pilots and engaging in delivering products and services, and also co-developing what the priorities will be for those particular projects. Internally at NOAA, I've brought on senior advisors in those roles, including an advisor for tribal engagement. Happens to be another Oregonian, I would point out, a member of the Nez Perce tribe with a PhD in fisheries biology, to help us engage with tribal communities. We similarly have elevated a position for equity in everything we do. We are building a number of internal frameworks for equity and climate that we are using as the guide rails on how we prioritize our investments.
Terrific. Yeah. Environmental justice is a pillar throughout our climate action plan. Assistant Secretary Medina, you mentioned the work at the Summit of the Americas. Can you talk about how the U.S. can learn from efforts that other nations have taken to research, map, and conserve natural solutions like blue carbon?
Absolutely. Thank you, Congresswoman. I think it's crucial that we listen and learn from other nations. What I hear everywhere I go is gratitude that the U.S. is back, but what I convey back to countries when I talk to them is how much we have to learn from them. And Indigenous knowledge is an important way that we can learn from other communities, other parts of the conversation that haven't always been heard. And we have something called the Islands 2030 Network, where we aim to do just that, bring together island communities so that they can not only share knowledge among themselves, but with us. I think it's very important that we never go into these discussions believing we have all the answers. We have to be listening.
Thank you. And because it's Oceans Week, Capitol Hill Ocean Week, I want to thank you also for your work on marine debris, particularly plastics, which we know are devastating to marine life and a problem that we absolutely need to tackle and can. So thank you for your work on that through NOAA, and I am over time and yield back. Thank you.
Next, Representative Graves, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. All right, so I started out by saying that sometimes people have trouble with being accurate, so watch this. People up here aren't required to tell the truth. That's, I'm going down. People aren't required to tell the truth. They can do whatever. They can say whatever. Y'all are, under the law, y'all are. Did I say at any point that the United States should not do anything until China does? Did I say that in my opening statement? No, I didn't. You know that. Yet it was interpreted that that's what I said. Let's see. What was the other one? Are you familiar with emissions related to U.S. energy production? Specifically, National Energy Technology Lab's assessment that was done in 2019, I think it was October, that found or compared U.S. emissions from natural gas delivered to Europe and Asia. You familiar with that? Ring any bells?
I'm familiar, but I couldn't cite the data.
Are you aware of just some rough comparison of emissions associated with U.S. energy delivered to Europe or other countries compared to, for example, Russian energy delivered? Which one would have a lower emissions profile? So, National Energy Tech, see, this is what happens. People make crap up. They just make it up. Didn't say anything that they just said, and then they sit there and legislate on it. So I'm going to ask unanimous consent, Madam Chair, to submit for the record a report from the National Energy Technology Labs that has found that U.S. gas delivered to Europe as compared to Russian gas. Russian gas has a 41% higher emissions profile delivered to Europe. It has a 47% higher emissions profile delivered to Asia. So I also, Madam Chair, would like
Madam Chair, I don't object to this study that shows that we have the prettiest horse at the glue factory.
Without objection.
Let's put it in the record. We got the prettiest horse at the glue factory.
Thank you. Without objection.
Madam Chair, I would like to submit and include in the record an analysis, the Energy Outlook by the Department of Energy under the Biden administration that projects the global demand in natural gas growing between now and 2050.
Without objection.
Thank you. So once again, people sit up here and they say things, they're just not true. And so then you wonder why we're in a situation where the right thing doesn't get done. You wonder why we're in a situation where people are out there proposing solutions in search of problems. You wonder why in the world our gasoline prices have more than doubled under this administration. Here's why. Because people make crap up and then they go and legislate on it. So I appreciate my friends, Mr. Huffman and Mr. Kasten, being here, and I appreciate y'all attempting to interpret my comments that are totally wrong. I also heard Mr. Kasten say that a home bought in South Louisiana would not survive a mortgage. I'd invite you to come down to South Louisiana. I would love to host you.
Would the gentleman entertain a question?
Not right now. I'd love to host you down there. Mr. Huffman, I appreciate you coming down. That statement is just completely ignorant. It's completely ignorant. Dr. Spinrad, I appreciate you being here. We sent you a letter together with about 70 members of Congress related to LOAs, related to seismic and offshore energy production. NOAA has acknowledged, or NIMS, National Marine Fisheries Service, has acknowledged that their modeling was incorrect. It was spitting out impacts that were not verified, justified, or accurate. It is holding up domestic energy production activities in the United States that directly is contrary to the statements that President Biden has made about the number of 9,000 APDs that have been approved in the United States. Could you tell me your plan forward on ensuring that that is resolved so we can produce energy in the United States, which results in lower emissions than production in other countries?
Yeah, thank you, sir. The short answer is that I'm working very closely with Director Levin over at Bureau of Ocean Energy Management to make sure that the interpretation of how incidental take, which is where the data, the area of the data confusion, is addressed, and we make sure that the interpretation of the incidental take data is applied appropriately in their activities from here forward. So
can you give me a timeline? Can you give me a timeline?
Not offhand. We can get back to you with the specifics.
I would appreciate it if you could.
Yes, sir.
Secretary Medina, I'm going to ask you to fill in the blank. This is a quote by Fatih Birol, and I'm sure I butchered that, but the executive director of the IEA, the International Energy Administration. This is a comment that he made toward the end of the Trump administration. He said, quote, "In the last 10 years, the emissions reduction in the blank has been the largest in the history of energy." Do you know which country he was referring to?
Congressman Graves, you've got me. I'm not going to try and guess. I'm not the energy expert within the State Department even, so I don't want to.
So I'll fill it in. In the last 10 years, the emissions reduction in the United States, has been the largest in the history of energy. United States emissions reduction has actually been lower than the next 7 emissions-reducing countries combined. So look, we can sit here and we can keep talking about how we're going to use pixie dust and all these things to power the nation's economy. Clearly, the strategy that's been implemented under this administration is impacting those who can least afford it the most. It's been a complete disaster. We're out there begging Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Venezuela to address our energy needs. This is a flawed strategy. It just doesn't work. It's not working for emissions, it's not working for affordability, and it's not working for energy security. And this shouldn't be a partisan issue. Nothing about it should be partisan. I just ask people to be rational and tell the truth. That's the only way we're going to solve these problems. Yield back.
Next, we'll go to Representative Levin. Welcome. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Castor, and thanks to everybody for being here. You know, I'm also honored to represent a beautiful coastal district. California's 49th district has some of the world's leading climate scientists. And as the representative for that community, the very least that I can do is listen to them. And one of the measures that has been really instrumental in my understanding of the climate crisis for my whole adult life is the Keeling curve and the measure of CO2 in the Earth's atmosphere, which I look at. You can follow it on Twitter. That's done at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography, right there in La Jolla. And just as of yesterday, 421 parts per million of CO2. That's a data point that is so indisputable. The question that we all have is what we're going to do about it. And I intend to work with whoever will work with me across the aisle to try to get anything done that we can to reduce our greenhouse gas footprint, whether it's from the cars we drive, the buildings we build, the type of electricity we're generating, the way we're growing food. We have to do it all, and we have to do it now. The science demands we act and that we take bold measures that are actually going to be up to the task. So with that in mind, my district is also home to beautiful estuaries. So I want to bring up a piece of bipartisan legislation. I introduced something called the Bipartisan Resilient Coasts and Estuaries Act, which would reauthorize the Coastal and Estuarine Land Conservation Program, which was created to provide grants to state and local governments to purchase land to protect coastal systems and wetlands. Congress stopped funding this program in 2013, and other federal funding mechanisms ran out in 2017. So our bill would reauthorize this crucial program and add climate change mitigation as one of the program's goals. Dr. Spinrad, can you talk about the role that protecting coastal ecosystems plays in combating the effects of the climate crisis?
Thank you, Congressman, and I appreciate your bringing to bear some of the information we're getting from NOAA's resources, including the Keeling curve from the Mauna Loa Observatory. I would just simply add, in my office, I have vials from each of the observatories around the globe, including Barrow, Alaska, and the South Pole, and the trend is not limited to Mauna Loa. So the role that coastal environments play in this regard is one that has, through recent scientific research, been demonstrated unequivocally, not just in terms of limiting activities, if you will, exploitative activities, extractive activities in many cases, but also serving as a key place for the development of blue carbon, as we discussed a little bit earlier, and of course as, if you will, nurseries for ensuring the biodiversity and the sustained growth of the ecosystem, which also contributes to the blue carbon inventory. So these special places, in our case it's the National Marine Sanctuaries or the National Estuarine Research Reserves, are critical components not just of conserving 30% of our lands and waters, but also ensuring that we become more climate resilient.
Thank you for that. So our bipartisan bill would also strengthen the National Estuarine Research Reserve System by requiring NOAA to establish 5 new reserves and expanding research guidelines to include long-term data monitoring and modeling on the impacts of climate change. How does the reserve system and the research done there help us measure the impacts of climate change on our nation's coastal communities?
Thank you. One of the things, I used to run the NEARS program when I was the head of the National Ocean Service, and I was particularly excited with the R that's associated with research in the National Estuarine Research Reserve System, because protection of those environments is one thing, but using them as natural laboratories is really where we get the most bang for the buck. So there are a limited set of natural laboratories that we can use to assess impacts of climate change. The NEARS system is really one of the jewels in the crown for that capability.
I want to turn for a moment to the blue economy. If done sustainably, aquaculture can create jobs in coastal communities and increase domestic seafood production. However, these industries are vulnerable to the effects of climate change as well. How is NOAA supporting new sustainable ocean-based industries to spur sustainable economic growth? And how are we ensuring that these opportunities, like aquaculture, are being deployed in a way that is resilient to the impacts of climate change in the future?
The build-out of the blue economy, and specifically what I call the new blue economy, is one of the pillars that I brought to the agency as a focal point for what we do. I am convinced that the use of knowledge, data, and information from the ocean is the gold of the future. That's going to drive economic development, by some estimates to the tune of an emerging $100 billion industry in climate services to serve the needs of local communities, building upon the fundamental products we will provide, but doing something similar for climate as was done with the commercial weather industry over the last 40 years. But for the full spectrum of ocean acidification, precipitation, sea level rise, all of the other phenomena.
Thank you very much. I'm out of time, but I just want to encourage us all. Let's step away from politics. Let's just look at the science and let's act in a manner commensurate with what the science demands. Thank you, and I'll yield back.
Thank you. Next up, Rep. Crenshaw, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Dr. Spinrad, for being here. Thank you, Assistant Secretary Medina. I want to talk about cleanliness in our oceans. None of us want trash in our oceans. None of us want plastic in our oceans. None of us want these things in our oceans either. And these were passed out for the committee hearing. It says more ocean, less plastic. Is this better in the ocean than this? Is there any compelling reason why that might be the case?
Assuming you're addressing the question to me.
Yeah.
I would argue anything we're putting into the ocean that is manufactured is not good for the ocean.
I agree. If I throw this away right now, is there a good chance it'll end up in the ocean?
Yes.
Really? American trash is what's ending up in the ocean?
Globally.
Really? Okay, so there's pretty good studies on this that would say that in the Pacific Ocean trash, and plastic specifically, the vast majority of it, over 90%, comes from Asia, African countries. Is that not true?
I think the numbers do tend to show that sort of increase on the part of the Asian countries, but that doesn't mean that we're not contributing to part of that as well.
How much do we contribute?
I don't have the answer at the top of my head.
It's like less than 1%, isn't it?
I don't know.
It is. I mean, because walk me through that. So if I throw this in the trash can right now, how does that end up in the ocean and not in a landfill nearby?
I can't give you the whole chain of how it goes from your.
But you said there's a good chance, you said that with some authority, that there's a good chance this ends up in the ocean. How is that true? I was a Navy SEAL in my prior career. I spent a lot of time in America's oceans. So how does this end up in the ocean so easily?
Well, again, I can't give you the whole chain of events associated with how our trash gets in the ocean, but I can tell you that the data are there. You can look at what is in the ocean.
The data is there. America is responsible for an incredibly small percent of any plastic in the ocean. Doesn't mean that's okay either. Look, we all want to diminish any kind of plastic waste in the ocean. So maybe let's talk about advanced recycling. You know, in my district, actually, there's a company called Huntsman that does amazing advanced recycling if they're allowed to. There's also legislation in the Clean Futures Act that would practically prohibit any new recycling facilities that deal with plastics, any new production of plastic. You know, and I wonder, is that really a is that a good thing to do?
To reduce the source of plastic that
From our
would end
country.
up in the ocean?
Does it end up? No, we already covered whether it ends up in the ocean.
No, but I'm trying to
It
understand
really
the
doesn't.
question.
No, advanced recycling. Because you might do one thing, right? And maybe it has good intentions. You want to have less plastic production in the United States, but it also has the second, third order consequence of reducing or making it impossible to engage in advanced recycling techniques. You know, what is the state of recycling in our country right now, considering we don't really export it to China the way we used to?
I can't answer that. I'm not an expert on recycling technology.
Ms. Medina, maybe she looked like she wanted to answer.
I can add just a little bit of light to this. The first thing is that we do still export a tremendous amount of our refuse, our waste. And it is true that only 5 or 6% of U.S. plastic is recycled today, and that's gone down in the last year. It's going in the wrong direction, which is why we're working so hard on a global agreement to combat plastic pollution everywhere, all over the world. And we need a global solution to this because it's not really different from climate. Plastic is everywhere. And if we can't stop having as much plastic in the system, we'll never get it out of the system. We need different materials, we need better recycling, and the agreement will take on the full life cycle of plastic. And we're standing shoulder to shoulder with the industry on this, not just the retailers, but also the makers of the very products that we're trying to figure out how to curb the pollution of. So I'm pretty optimistic. It's going to take a lot. We're going to need a lot of innovation. We're going to need more plants that do that recycling. We're going to need to create an economy where that recycled bottle has value. This one too. This one has more value, which is why it's a little less likely.
I want to ask one more question. Your answer makes a lot of sense, and I appreciate you acknowledging that it's clearly a global problem that you have to deal with other countries on, especially the countries that are putting the vast, vast majority of waste into the ocean. The next question was, it was mentioned earlier that you think sea levels will rise in the Gulf by 2 feet by 2050. The obvious next question is there anything we can actually do to stop that? Because that question indicates what the solutions might be. If we stopped all carbon emissions globally right now, would that change that rise in sea level?
The answer to the last question is that if we went to net zero tomorrow, we would still have to deal with sea level rise, ocean acidification, all those factors. That's the flywheel effect, as we call it, and that we're seeing in climate change. It's going to happen.
Right, it's going to happen, and it makes preparing for it and the infrastructure necessary to deal with it all the more important. And if I had more time, I could go on a long tirade about cost and benefit and how we should spend that money, but I don't, and I'm out of time. Thank you so much. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Madam Chair, could I ask a very quick point of inquiry, because I'm genuinely curious, and if I understood the gentleman correctly, I think he was suggesting that this may be a form of plastic bottle.
Do you want to ask? I'll let you ask.
I wanted to ask if you could clarify. I believe this is aluminum, and I believe it is truly recyclable, unlike the so-called recyclable plastic, which we know is a joke. Could you just clarify what the heck this is so that we all have a common set of facts?
In typical disingenuous form, I'll answer your disingenuous question.
Well, I'm asking
of course, I realize it's different, which is why I made the comparison.
Okay, I think I misunderstood you.
I'm just wondering, what I was asking was, is this, we passed these out, almost making the implication that these are better for the environment than this, but, and it says ocean on it, right? So there's an implication here that this is better for the ocean than this one, which is why I asked that question. Because clearly, any trash in the ocean is the opposite of what we want, right?
Well, I look forward to the next hearing maybe when we can dive into this a little bit more. But I thank you so much for joining us on Capitol Hill Ocean Week, Dr. Spinrad and Secretary Medina. Thank you for your service to America. Thank you for all that you do to protect our ocean resources that are key to the economic vitality of communities across the country. So without objection, I'd like to enter into the record an October 15, 2021 letter from 118 organizations and businesses supporting the development of the U.S. Ocean Climate Action Plan. Without objection, members will have 10 business days within which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses, and I ask you to please respond as quickly as you are able. And thank you to the Scuba Nauts for being in attendance. Today, the hearing is adjourned.